How can you cultivate an opportunity for discovery in this problem that you have? How can you unleash untapped potential? How can you reinvigorate the enthusiasm for a challenge? How can you illuminate a pathway to wonder along? How can you open up creative possibilities in disruption? How can you unlock strength by embracing difference? How can you seek questions to follow?
Hello and welcome to the Days of Change podcast. Today we'll do a kind of a roadshow because the guest I have with me has been on the road for a substantial part of his life. As far as I can see, it is this kind of life which some of us would probably long for, but we also know that it comes at a cost. It seems to me that a main driver for this road trip has been my guest's curiosity, and curiosity will be the main topic of our conversation. We will talk about how we can cultivate opportunities for discovery in organizations and in life, how to unleash untapped potential, how to illuminate pathways to wander along, and how to open up creative possibilities in times of disruption. I'm excited. The Days of Change podcast brings you personal stories of people who are passionate about change and see it as their purpose to help organizations and the individuals within to embrace change. You can listen to other episodes of the podcast and find all the show notes on our website, which is changedays.com/podcast. My guest today is Nik Beeson from Toronto, Canada. It's impossible to describe him in a few words. As I said, his life has been colorful to say the least. His LinkedIn profile gives some indications of this. There he calls himself a change navigator, curiosity and resilience cultivator, and his bio includes 10 years of experience as a tree planter, work as a communication coordinator and web expert for a circus, the Canadian Music Centre, and an ecological justice and human rights organization. He himself is a musician, and you have heard already some of his music in the intro, and you will hear more at the show. That's far from describing his life because he has also worked as a spiritual counselor in a hospital in Toronto. And on another occasion, he lived for an extended period in the wilderness, among other things responsible for whale watching. There's much more, and let's see how much of this exciting life we can cover in the show and how much we'll talk about the subject, curiosity. Nik is one of the initiators of the Toronto Change Days, and he runs his company called Curiosity Culture. His website says, "Curiosity is our most useful aptitude and motivation for resiliently navigating and instigating disruptive and transformative change." Let's talk about that later on. Nik is an amazing individual and a true friend, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Welcome to the Days of Change podcast, Nik Beeson.
Thanks so much, Holger. It's great to be here and really, really great to have a little bit of time with you.
Yeah, we don't do that often enough, Nik. We should do that more
No.
often. But now we have an hour to talk.
Yes.
It? Nik, consider your life was made into a movie. What would be the title and who would be the main actor?
The title would be Curiously Roaming, something like that. I don't know if there could be a main character. I think there would have to be a lot of characters, one of those movies where you're never quite sure who the main character is, and it's kind of unpredictable.
Yeah, I also don't have an idea. I have to think about actually who I would see as the actor playing. Obviously, you have filled a library of notebooks with your own texts and drawings. If I had the job to curate them, what patterns would I find?
Yeah, good question. I actually was on a brief retreat looking after a friend's farm. This would be about 8 months ago or so, and I took a moment and pulled out all these notebooks going way, way, way back and started to scribble down the various themes that seemed to be emerging. But there is a kind of consistency. Earlier, I guess you could say I was kind of obsessed with consciousness And I had a sort of fairly specific interpretation of what that meant for me. But other themes are addictions being one. And by that, I mean something a little bit close to the Buddhist word samsara, essentially cyclical patterns of behavior that we get into, and they can be quite deep, and we can be basically unconscious of them. That's another theme for sure. And, certainly love is a big theme. I studied theology, and that was something I was deeply focused on. And by love, I think I mean really what we're really trying to understand in our brief passage in this life. I used to tell my boys, this is what we're here for, is to essentially bear the beams of love. And so, that's underneath all the chatter in my notebooks and in my thinking. I guess I'm trying to figure that out and trying to align myself with it, varying degrees of success, I'd say.
Yeah, there are already so many threads in what you said. I hope I can pick up some of them. I particularly like your notion of our task is to bring the beam of love into life. And I think that's certainly part of my philosophy as well. But let's get to all of that bit by bit. So let's start with the early beginnings. How did you grow up, and what were the early seeds to your later life in your childhood?
I was raised really as a rationalist. My parents were immigrants from Britain. My understanding of how you figure things out was you apply your mind to them, and there has to be evidence. I did, however, I guess in my teens, I sort of had as often we do, you have a kind of a crisis, of like, I don't understand how this is all working. And I became quite interested in certain forms of spirituality. Initially, I was really, really fascinated by the Gospels. I had never been exposed to them at all, and I had never been in a church. And when I read them, I was sort of shocked because they were sort of depicting this really rebellious character, and I didn't get that vibe from church. So I became quite curious, and I did get involved in some unusual sort of radical Christian communities. You could have called them, I suppose, Christian anarchists when I was quite young, and living in community with these folks. So that was a start. I migrated through a variety of different spiritualities, and I think at that point in my life, when I was quite young, I was really, that's all I really cared about. It was this kind of quest for trying to know what the truth is. And it took me through Buddhism and a variety of other, anything that.
Sounds like you read Hermann Hesse at that time.
Well, it's so funny, Holger, you say that, because I recently reread Narcissus and Goldman, and I think you probably know that book.
I read it like 45 years ago and never again since then, yeah.
Yeah, well, it was about then that I read it a long, long time ago, and for some reason I revisited it. And the main character is this Goldman character who really roams around a lot, and then at the end, builds these sculptures. He's an artist, and he takes all his experiences and pours them into these things. And I sort of feel a little bit like that's where I'm at. There's been a lot of experiences of great diversity, and now I'm at a point where I'm trying to put it all together in some way which is useful. So anyway, yes, yeah. I did read Hermann Hesse.
As I said in my introduction, your life feels a full road movie. Take us on a trip a little bit. I know you went to Bangladesh in the early 80s, I guess for a voluntary project or so. How did that change your life? What did you learn there? What happened then?
Yeah, that was extraordinary. At that time in Canada, we had this program called Canada World Youth, and you could volunteer to join this. And it involved a group of Bangladesh. My program ended up going to Bangladesh, which was it was very intense. Bangladesh was at the time really the most poverty-stricken country on earth. It was also the most densely populated. And I was coming out of a private school in downtown Toronto. I was 18. The fascinating thing was that the program was a complete disaster, logistically and in sort of every way. The money was stolen by the local Bangladesh organization, and it was just mayhem. But in a way that was great, because that's how things work there. They don't. And it was a very powerful exposure at a very young age to really an extreme situation. I have to say, I mean, we were all, I was with a group of young Canadians, and I think we were all pretty shocked. But it had a huge impact on me, of course. I was quite young and had lived in a certain environment, and I wasn't the same when I returned, that's for sure.
Sure. And later on, you studied theology, Buddhism, human consciousness, and a couple of other things. Then obviously there was another shift. What I figure out, there was this period of where you went into ecological activities, the famous 10 years as a tree planter. Please make the connection. So from Bangladesh through your studies,
Sure.
theology, and then the tree planter. What happened?
Well, tree planting in Canada is something that's actually frequently done by students. Our education isn't paid for, and so we tear off in the summers to try and make money to pay for our education, so we're not too far in debt by the time we end it. And so it's actually really quite common. You'll find there's a lot of people who planted trees, and essentially you go way up north somewhere, or it could be, I planted in North Ontario, North Alberta, and out on the west coast and in the mountains. Yeah, it's kind of really hardcore manual labor. You're paid per tree, so it's piecework. You have to have to keep moving, and there's a lot of bugs and bears, but that was something that I got used to doing every summer. At the end of every summer, I always vowed I will never ever do this again because it's insane. And by the time the next spring rolled around, you were kind of weirdly missing it. I wasn't doing that out of, particularly an ecological concern. I was essentially doing it to pay for my education. But of course, it was fantastic to be way out in the bush. It's very isolated. You live in camps, and you spend a lot of time alone. Pretty much every day you're planning all alone. That's how it works normally. So there was an attraction to it. And, I guess, we did feel, hey, we're putting trees back in the ground. That's good. I was always pretty compelled by ecological issues. I also was involved in civil disobedience in my early 20s.
And you still are from time to time, I know.
That's true, yeah. Not quite as intensely, that's for sure. But yeah, I did get thrown in jail for a couple of weeks for that when I was young. That was
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
For what were you thrown in jail? What was the charge?
It was mischief. We were blockading a road, a logging road. That's what we were doing. And so we got carried away. Eventually I was charged with mischief, and I was actually given 6 weeks, but I behaved well, so they let me out early. But
okay.
yeah, it's actually very, very funny because it's where I actually met my son's mom, my two sons' mom, in the back of a police van up north there. That's where we first met. So that's kind of a cool story.
Yeah, that's really a cool story. So she was also in jail or what? Or
well, no, we were arrested together, and then we got thrown in a van, and they wouldn't let us out of the van for many, many hours.
What a romantic story.
Yeah,
well, I keep saying this is a movie. So Nik, so we are probably now in your 20s, late 20s, early 30s or something like that. You went to school, you studied all this stuff, and probably we come more to the topics later on when we talk about curiosity. And now I know you're in your 50s. So there was this time between then and now where you, according to what I know from you, you did a lot of different things. I mean, living in the wilderness, trekking through Canada. What were your constitution, your mental state like in that time, and what were you looking for, and what did you do? Give us a few stories and a little bit of a background.
I think I was trying to do two things pretty consistently. I was very occupied with, I think, what you would call service. At least that's sort of how I saw it. I was thinking, that's what we're here for. I did do quite a lot of work working with folks who were in a homeless community street people. I was living in houses, staffing them voluntarily. And this could be we would be hosting people who were street people or out of jail, things like that. And then in another case, for a while, I was doing living in a home which was for people who had been hospitalized for mental illness. I was interested in how people can be healed. And I know that was for sure a preoccupation for me. And, I was certainly continuing to try and understand, how do we learn to love, I suppose. I mean, that was, I think, what I was trying to understand. So I think that was guiding my thinking and my activity for quite a while. I think, a big change was having kids.
Did you stop this kind of life then?
I would say yes, I would say so. My journey became at that point, being a dad and looking after my kids, bringing in some money. You couldn't voluntarily staff homes anymore when you had kids. So I think things became much more circumscribed at that point, and my project was really being a father.
Was that the time when you worked as a spiritual chaplain at the Toronto hospital, or was that before?
That's true. That was the time when I was doing it. I got into digital communications. I mean, very early on. I guess I was building websites sort of in 1996. That's kind of how I figured, okay, I can make a living. But I wasn't enjoying it that much, and I did start in a residency to become a spiritual care person in hospitals, and that's when I was working in the hospital. And that was an extraordinary experience. Frankly, I wish it could have continued. And I won't go into why it ended. It's kind of complicated, but it was a very, very moving place to work. And it was typically, as a spiritual care person in a hospital, we were called into pretty catastrophic situations. That was really what we were very frequently called in for. I experienced people whose lives had been going relatively normally, and they suddenly, everything changed as a result of, a catastrophe of some kind, a physical catastrophe. And in a sense, that was my very radical introduction to disruption. And I think there's no question that had a huge influence on my work now, because what I sensed was that you were very, very aware of people's kind of raw identity, and that their identity had been, in a sense, broken. How they understood who they were, it was broken, and they were trying to put it back together again. And in a sense, my role was to try and just be with them, and if I was really on form, ask some good questions which somehow got them in touch with really deeper meaning in their lives, because that could be hard sometimes for people to make contact with. But if they could find that, they had much more likelihood of, finding a way through.
I could go for hours talking about your experiences, but I would like to come to the recent period. And the episode now for your life is that you partner with Rich Batchelor, who I made sing the Welsh anthem in another episode of this podcast.
Yes,
and from the life you were living previously, and we'll slowly come to the issue of curiosity, but from the life you were living for 40 or more years, how did you make the transition to the professional work you're doing now as a facilitator, trainer, whatever you do now? We'll come to that in a moment. But how did this transition period happen, and what was the catalyst for that?
Yeah, it's fairly clear. I was, I continued to work in digital communications. I was working at Ecological Justice and Human Rights Org in Toronto. It was a pretty cool job, and it was, the whole thing had migrated to advocacy and campaigning. It was that kind of work. It was digital communications, advocacy, and campaigning, and I had the good fortune of connecting with a community called, actually, Web of Change, believe it or not, started by a guy called Jason Mogus out in the West Coast. And it was, an annual conference of digital activists, essentially. And I was getting a pretty good education from them on how to do digital campaigning. But what I began to find was, coming up with really good advocacy, digital campaign required changes in the structure of the organization itself. Digital communications was becoming sort of more and more important. And I began having friction around strategic ideas that I had, and I was pushing hard for in my organization. And I was meeting a lot of resistance, and it sort of baffled me, because they seem to make sense logically. And so I was experiencing a lot of friction, and I began to become curious about the friction. And, I would go into meetings going like, how hot can I make this? I used to say that I was, turning up the heat to sort of try and make a situation more malleable. But if you turn it up too much, it would flip and work the other way. Like you get more resistance. So I suddenly realized that was preoccupying me. And then I came across that quote, which I'm sure you know, and which everyone knows: culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I was sort of shocked by that. I'd never really thought about that, this notion of culture eating strategy. And I suddenly realized that, well, that's what's happening, that I'm preoccupied with strategy, and I have a cultural situation which I'm not understanding. Then I became really interested in that, and I suddenly realized, wow, this is way more interesting than trying to figure out a new software platform. I literally just jumped out of my job, you could say. And I didn't even know really anything about the world of change or organizational change. I'd never heard of change management. I didn't know it existed. But I was lucky because I started working out of the Center for Social Innovation, and I was introduced to Rich. And
all right, okay.
And Rich, by that point, had been working for 30 years almost in change management. So yeah. That was a big change. And in fact, the first thing we did was I traded him some good web stuff for a course that he teaches on change agency. And then he also invited me to join this Curiosity project. So that's where that started.
Okay. Yeah. So let's get into that.
Sure.
You're now giving open and in-house courses on curiosity. So this is really your topic. What's your definition of curiosity, and why do you think it is important? It is an important trait people should rediscover.
It's actually something, I guess you could say, I continue to maybe struggle with is the wrong word for, but I think we sort of use the word and we sort of think we know what it is. But I found as I began to really dive farther and farther into it that, wow, it's actually much deeper than I sort of originally thought. One of the ways I find myself describing it, that it's actually something quite close to mindfulness. And it's obviously you could say it's a behavior, it's an aptitude, it's an attitude towards life. It's a kind of a focus, but it requires something akin to mindfulness in that it's fundamentally non-judgmental, and it's a deep, deep human drive. I see now that it maybe is the most significant drive in human beings. I see it now as being probably our most effective evolutionary strategy, was this constant desire to pursue learning. And it's really connected to consciousness itself. And, it's really at the heart of human evolution is this curiosity, which is, it's astonishing what people will do when they really want to know something, when they really want to learn something. They'll give up everything. They'll give up their families, they'll give up money. When you think about explorers who are, I guess the classic curious people, for some reason, they want to go and find out what's over the horizon. They don't even, it's often extremely risky. There's something compelling about it that really gets people, and they learn and learn.
In my question before, I used the word rediscover, and I think that's a common assumption. And you read a lot of Facebook posts nowadays which say that children are all curious, aren't they? And then we stop being curious. Is that true, that we stop being curious? And if so, obviously you didn't stop being curious. I didn't stop being curious. So is that just an assumption or a bias or a stereotype that people lose their curiosity out of whatever fear, resistance, and things like that? Do we need to rediscover curiosity?
Yes, I agree with a lot of the research. When you're around little kids, they're just driven to learn. They have this incredible hunger, and it drops off precipitously when they go to school. A big part of the reason for that is that in school you're rewarded for having answers and not for asking questions so much, and that changes the whole dynamic around curiosity. Because if you're rewarded for having answers, then you want to get them, and you want to please people by getting the right answer. Children will sense that when they're asking a difficult question, they don't know it's a difficult question, but they'll sense a kind of unease in a person that they're asking a question of. And if the person doesn't know the answer, or if it's embarrassing, children will ask quite embarrassing questions sometimes. So I think that's where the dynamic changes. I think I am curious about quite a lot of things. But I do know that I'm actually very not curious about other things. There's aspects of my life which I've become quite defensive.
For example?
To be perfectly honest, I think the places where I've seen it most vividly is in long-term relationships. I'm not with my boy's mom now, and in the sort of hurly-burly of a long-term relationship, for example, all kinds of unconscious defensiveness comes up, and these are vulnerabilities which no one's to be blamed for, but they exist, and when they're probed in some way or other, a person reacts. But that's precisely where we aren't curious. One of the really interesting things I began learning when I started studying curiosity was I was also researching trauma and PTSD. The research there was really clear that that's one of the first things that goes away when people are traumatized and when they're afraid, is they lose their curiosity. There's memories which arise when triggered. Those memories tell a story that already happened and it's not happening now. But
that's interesting. That's interesting, yeah, what you're saying. So in times of crisis or disruption, as we see it now, curiosity drops. That's what you're saying.
Well, it will drop if people are afraid.
And that's what's happening usually in times of crisis and disruption.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's unfortunately, it's kind of the worst thing that can happen in a time of disruption. It's almost like our instinctive responses are likely to exacerbate the problem. And I witness that myself all the time. When I'm challenged very strongly by something which is making me feel very worried or afraid, and my reactions, I mean, in the world of trauma, they call it fight, flight, freeze. Those reactions are not helpful. None of them are. They're kind of very basic survival reactions, and typically they're not really that useful in the situations that we're in. What's useful is trying to look at the situation as a problem that needs to be solved, and it can be quite creative, and it can be an opportunity typically. But we experience something different quite often.
So that sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, the key to, let's say, re-evoke, to rediscover curiosity. I'm talking about the work you're doing with your clients in your courses is probably on a different level. It's probably to think about your fears and your anxieties and your resistances and your body reactions and so on. Is that the key to the first entrance point to rediscovering curiosity?
Yeah, that's exactly it, Holger. I mean, this is why it's been such a trip to follow up on this, because I think typically curiosity sounds like fun and openness, and but it's challenging, and it is something close to hard meditation. So yes, curiosity is kind of going into that space where if you are afraid, you are going to have a hard time being curious. And there's all kinds of physiological indications of what's happening when you're afraid, and how can you become conscious of that? And then of course the question is, how can you move that over from fear into interest? What I've really found myself moving towards, and I'm giving a workshop just on Saturday, is resilience. This is what became the response. If you're resilient, you're less likely to feel afraid. And that's become more and more what I'm finding myself going, well, then if people want to if I'm trying to find a way to cultivate curiosity, the way to do it seems to be to increase resilience.
So Nik, what are some of the techniques or tools or games or exercises you do with your clients?
There's a variety, and I guess you could say I keep on trying to open up new ones. What's really important, and on the one hand, you can talk about what curiosity is and the research, but what's great is to try and create situations in which people experience curiosity, and one of the ways of doing that is by surprising people. But another thing that we can do is try and ask questions around some of the basic facets of curiosity, which are the nature of discovery. And I've worked on a kind of it's not an acronym, but it's using the word curious, and there's a series of questions about how can you be curious. And I can try a couple of them on you, Holger, if you want, because I think they're a series of, basically they're just sentences which are points of reflection on a situation that you're in.
So why don't you try that with me? Would that be a possibility?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, let's do it.
So I think the thing to start with is if you can think about a really challenging situation that you're in, that you're trying to find answers for, and that you may feel a bit stuck around, and it could be something that's disruptive, or it could be something that you're stuck with. And if you could kind of bring to mind something like that.
Right. Sure, absolutely. So what comes to my mind is the global expansion of the change days, which has been on my mind for a while, and we have been working on that for a while. And it's now time for another phase where really the change days could go not only global, but also branch out into different sectors and different activities. That's what's challenging me in the moment.
Okay. I'll pose a series of they're like sentences, and I'm going to read them out to you, and then maybe we can choose one, and maybe there's one which jumps out to you, but we'll see. So Here's the sentence. It's how can you, here's one, how can you cultivate an opportunity for discovery in this problem that you have? How can you unleash untapped potential? How can you reinvigorate the enthusiasm for a challenge? How can you illuminate a pathway to wonder along? How can you open up creative possibilities in disruption? How can you unlock strength by embracing difference? How can you seek questions to follow? Is there one of those sentences that you feel kind of
all of them, but let me choose one or two.
Yeah.
I think the first one's opportunities to discover, unleash potential, look at strengths. Yeah, it's basically a combination of all of them. But what comes to my mind is that there is this incredible global group of supporters of the change days, and different people, different characters. And I think the challenge for me will be to develop a way of being passionate, being open, bringing in ideas, but at the same time, for me to let go of control, which is one of my challenges. I'm sometimes I'm quite a control freak. Sometimes I'm not, and I have to find out what's the difference. When am I a control freak and when am I not? That's quite interesting. We had actually a nice podcast with Sue Knight where she really challenged me on that already. So yeah, I think it's about this letting go of control, and on the other side, inspire passion in other people to join me along the road.
Yeah, it's almost like you came up with when one of those phrases is seek questions to follow, and I think in a sense you came up with one right there. Was when do I need control and when do I not need it? So in a sense, maybe that's an interesting question for you to follow. Sounds pretty juicy.
Yeah, I think it goes deep. Actually, it goes deeper because actually I would like to give up much more control.
Right.
I don't need it. Well, sometimes I need it, of course. Yeah, it's about quality and things like that.
Yes. Yes.
But in general, I would say mentally, I'm prepared to give up control and let others take over. And
right.
I think I have to find out on a deeper level what stops me from that. It's not the mental awareness. I'm totally aware that I want to give up control. And it's interesting because I had a client last year who was at the same level, and I think I have to talk to him. Actually, it was quite interesting what this guy does, and he was he was the CEO of a small consulting company, and I worked with a team, and he was such a control extrovert type, but a very nice one. I really loved him, and I loved his team. And what he did in his company, he introduced sociocracy as a way of self-organization of teams and more responsibility, which forces him by the statute of the new organization to draw out. And probably I have to follow his example by also introducing rules, let's say rules and principles, which force me to give up control.
It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's quite a good good reflection right off the bat.
Yeah, I love that. Okay.
Yeah. So already in a sense, part of giving up control, unlocks strength by embracing difference. You're being forced to let different notions take charge, it is important to recognize, well, as you said, there's a quality thing, and so there's an element of you're needing to keep a handle on it, and it's trying to find the balance there.
Okay, as you will be involved in these activities, please hold me accountable for that.
Okay, thank you. I will do my best. Yeah.
Nik, anything else before we leave the topic of curiosity, because I have more things with you to discuss? Anything else very important that you need to say about your favorite topic of curiosity?
Well, I guess the last thing I think it's worth talking about it, and you were starting to touch on it and probe into it, in that it's such a deep question, how to cultivate curiosity. And I began starting to think, wow, it's almost like a religious thing or a spiritual thing, which concerned me slightly in a way. But it made me laugh because, we've both experienced the work of the Ummelin brothers and the church. And I suddenly went, wow, that's kind of what they're up to. And maybe I shouldn't be so shy about this, that this cultivation of curiosity, it is a very deep thing. And it is, religious is the wrong word for it, but it is a kind of a deep quest, a kind of a soul quest, and it's big.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't, and I think the thing that's challenging, and I think you can understand this, is, when you're trying to bring this into an organization as an idea that's worth pursuing, typically in North America anyway, and certainly around Toronto, people want a thing that they can apply tomorrow. It's hard to bridge that gap between, well, this is really trying to learn a kind of fundamental behavioral shift, and it's not a set of forms that you can fill out. And also, curiosity is really difficult to measure. How do you know when somebody's being curious and when they're not being curious? Is it a set of questions you give them going, oh, were you open-minded in this situation? Rate it 1 to 5. I don't think that really works, because everyone knows what the answer for that's supposed to be.
We need to talk about your music, which our
Okay.
listeners can find on SoundCloud and Spotify. You are a gifted musician. The introduction song, which I'll play again at the end, is from your earlier work. It's called Not in Kansas.
It's a very good, so actually it's very interesting because it's a song which is very, very much about curiosity in some ways. Yeah.
Oh, tell me more.
Well, it's, it's funny because I didn't really think of this until much later, but it's so close to the themes of curiosity that I've actually thought of playing it in my workshop. Because the song is about, it's sort of two themes are going on in it. One is about the Wizard of Oz, and you're not in Kansas anymore, and Kansas being home and safety, and the farm, and black and white, and that's what change is. That's what poor old Dorothy. A tornado comes down and sucks her out of her safe place, and she ends up in the land of Oz, and
Right.
she's got to go on a quest to figure something out.
So I'd say Not in Kansas is by its form rather a traditional folk song, a very nice one.
12-bar blues.
The music
Yeah.
we're recording now is different, or for the last years. It's not the kind of music you would play as background of a candlelight dinner, I must say. And I'll put the link to all your songs into the show notes, which is at changedays.com/podcast. Listening to your music requires attention, and as I would say, a certain musical maturity. I'm happy that I received a thorough musical education at high school, and I'm really fascinated about your oeuvre. Let's play a 2 minutes out of a 16 minutes tune, which is called Sued, and let's talk about that later on.
Okay.
Tell us about this tune and how that represents your music.
Yeah, Sid, I wrote quite a long time ago, but it was specifically oriented around a change process. I was really, I was fascinated by evolutionary theory. And I guess one of the things I realized about music was that it's something that happens through time, which makes it unique. So it can evolve. I became interested in trying to sort of demonstrate a process musically. And so the piece itself is very, very minimal for a very long time. And there's just this kind of repetitive pattern of things, but it is always changing slightly. And at a certain point, it's as if it reached as a threshold, and then suddenly something big happens. Now, originally, there's two significant shifts in the piece. So there's one kind of break or disruption which occurs I don't know, I can't remember how many minutes in now, but and that creates a considerable shift in the kind of repetitive pattern that is going on. But a repetitive pattern sort of re-instigates itself, but then it too starts shifting, and then eventually there's a sort of huge transformation, catastrophic change in the sound, and it becomes kind of choral or choir-like.
Okay, yeah. I would like to play so many other few tunes. I would like to play one little piece, again, also not the entire song, which is called Ramadan at Sunset, which I like a lot because I have a strong connection to the Arabic culture, to Muslim countries. I've been there many, many times in my life. I have a lot of friends in these countries, and I remember Ramadans at sunset.
Wow.
Vividly. I wasn't really fasting. I think I tried only once in my life to fast together with my colleagues in Somalia a long time ago. That's an interesting piece. So give me a short description. How did you come up with this one? And then I'll play a little tune of it.
Okay. I was in Cairo. I was quite young, and I remember, in the morning when all the muezzins would start up, there were so many, they would do the call to prayer, and you would hear it start in one place, and then another muezzin would start, and then another, and they had these crazy loudspeakers, which were sort of poor quality. And eventually I remember feeling like there were so many going simultaneously that it really just sounded like a swarm. And I was really quite young when I was there, and I was certainly affected by the poverty. I remember walking through the Dead City, and this is a vast graveyard, and there were hundreds of families living in it. It had a powerful effect on me, of course, and okay. I think that's what the lyrics are about. Anyway, the music itself was a marvelously fun improvisation that I was doing with a bunch of friends.
Great. So let's listen into it a little bit.
Sunset. The sound of the thousand muezzins wailing for neon minarets is like the buzz of 12 million bees swarming into the grave honeycomb of the dead city. Hear the children play hide and seek and cry and laugh amongst the laundry draped over the dead's epitaphs. There is less remorse when there is no recourse. People die and the clothes are dry. People die and the clothes are dry. The sun, the brilliant atom disk, the eternally fulfilling global...
Listeners, if you want to hear more of Nik's music, please visit our website at changedays.com/podcast, and I will play the Not in Kansas song in full at the end of this episode. So just wait for the end of this episode and then listen to the entire song. Nik, the last thing we need to touch upon is obviously the Change Days. As I said at the beginning, you are the co-founder of the Toronto Change Days together with Rich Batchelor, and you had been a frequent guest to the Berlin Change Days. Mm-hmm. That's where we became friends.
Yeah.
What fascinates you about the Change Days?
It was Richard who, told me about it. He was so determined to go, and I just started working with him. And I remember the theme that my first year was disruption. He was describing it as this, experience where people, you could do workshops which were really challenging and sort of daring. And I remember I came up with this idea of demonstrating disruptive change through Afro-Cuban percussion. We just went with it, and I had no idea whether it was going to work, but we arrived there. And I remember, Holger, the first time you hold the meetings with the facilitators a little bit before the whole thing starts. It's sort of a brief introduction so yes. The facilitators can kind of meet each other. And I remember walking into that room just going, wow, there's a lot of really smart people in here. No one had to say anything. I just had to look around the room. And I was really thrilled by the sort of level of engagement and curiosity of the people in the room. And then there's just this incredible warmth. People were kind. They wanted to meet you. They wanted to learn about you. And but Rich and I, we really, really, really wanted something like that here in Toronto. Rich once went, we're going to do one here, and he was very determined about that. And so that's what we did. We started the first one last year, and yeah, you were there, and I feel like somehow we managed to bring some of that energy from Berlin, that kind of daring warmth, and I think it was a success. But I value it highly, Holger. It's been a great experience, and the relationships I've made there and the things I've learned are, that changed a lot how things work. Honestly, I don't know how I would have kept on doing this if it wasn't for being able to go to Berlin and get refreshed once a year.
Yeah, and let's do that again this year in Berlin and in Toronto. Nik, as I expected, that was an exciting road trip. I would love to continue, and we will continue in private to share our stories, because it's all about storytelling. Thanks very much for having been my guest today, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Holger. It's been just a real pleasure. I don't think I've ever gone through a journey quite like that. And I thanks so much for your curiosity about me. And I really likewise, I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Me out of my bag down. Something tells me, well, I'm not in Kansas anymore. Something tells me, well, I'm not in Kansas anymore. No ground under my feet, and the carpet fall out from the floor. Something tells me, well, I'm not in Kansas anymore. Something tells me, this isn't Kansas, is it? Yeah, Evie got suckered by that snake. Now behind us a flaming sound. Well, I'm rolling round and round and round, yeah, rolling round and round. Rolling round and round and round, yeah, rolling round and round. No ground, I got no ground, yes, I'm rolling round and round and round, yeah, rolling round and round. I'm on the back of a steel shell, spiraling towards the ground. Something tells me I'm in the land of no. and magical symmetry. Decided no do, but I'm dancing on the waves. Well, don't get settled in, cause this is no place to stay, but you can't get up away. Neither. Something tells me we couldn't stay in Kansas anymore. Something tells me we couldn't, no, we couldn't stay. Yeah, if she knew we had to leave that place, if she knew we had to leave that place and set out for the other.